you don't mind, before I speak, I need to take a quick. No, I do speak honestly when I do say this is an honor that I know for me personally, and I know for Caleb as well, we do not take lightly to have you guys come. It's just an extreme blessing and an honor to have you here. I guess what I want to start out by is to see all these people here, and maybe some of you here are sort of, well, how does the Constitution affect me as a person? You know, isn't that just something that more affects those in Washington or in Concord or Augusta? How does it affect with me personally here, in this case in Albany, New Hampshire, or wherever you live individually? And the fact of the matter is that the Constitution affects every single person in everyday life. The fact that we come and we speak our personal opinions on really anything from cooking to politics to any general subject is the Constitution at work, because it allows freedom of speech. The fact that we're here today as a general assembled group is the Constitution at work. The fact that on Sundays we can choose where to go to church or whether we go to church on Sunday is the Constitution at work. That's just to name a few of the many blessings that don't come in normal countries. The fact that every 2 years we're able to go to the polls and vote for who our elected officials are is something that not every person in the world has that, and especially where it's a fairly the integrity of the election system is fairly sound here as well, whereas in many nations, even though they do have an election, it's generally a very tilted to the party in power, and that's one of just the hallmarks of our republic, and it is something that makes us truly a special country. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this speech, it's that the Constitution's important to you individually and to me individually, because there are two ways to look at the Constitution. You can look at it as a document that isn't really all that important to you. It's just this old, dry, historical document. And if you do that, you'll fall asleep before the first session's over. But if you view it as a document that's important to your freedom, that allows you to live a free life, suddenly it'll become much more interesting to listen to different people and to hear about the Constitution, because suddenly it's something that's affecting you personally and is helping promote your freedom. And if you have any qualms about the excitement of this event, don't worry. If you can make it through this first speech here, everything's uphill from there, so don't worry about it. So what I want to jump into with the main part of my speech this afternoon is the two battling interpretations of the Constitution. And then, if I have time, I'll look at an example of how that affects debate and discussion. There's the loose interpretation of the Constitution, and there's the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the loose interpretation of the Constitution is pretty much the belief that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that changes with culture, time, and what the majority opinion feels. And that the words sort of can change. They can mean one thing at one point, but they can change over time as culture moves along. The strict interpretation stands on when the founders wrote it back in 1787, and when it was officially passed, it means today what it meant then. And it's important to look at these because it does affect the entire shaping of how you think of the Constitution as a document and how you will interpret it and what you think the Constitution says and does. So let's look at the evidence that is put out for the loose interpretation of the Constitution, and then we'll look at where I truly believe that the Constitution does actually lead and where we can actually see it. The loose interpretation is often considered one of their main arguments, one of the main discussions, is the founders were smart enough to not create a never-changing document. So in other words, what they often say, and I pulled this was an article from the Huffington Post arguing for a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He said, "There is no doubting the collective greatness of the framers. They were able to craft a document that surpassed their idealistic imagination. However, Charles Pinckney was a great American statesman who played a key role in ratifying the Constitution. He also reportedly owned 300 slaves. Does the originalist perspective suggest that we embrace in totally what Pinckney intended? Though I would not consider myself on an intellectual par with James Madison, I would say that I have a better understanding of what we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, looks like in the 21st century." So pretty much their statement is that, well, if you have a concrete document then it can't change, and we would still be embracing some of the faults that our Constitution had at the start. The other evidence they give is something called the elastic clause. Now, how many of you have heard people bring up the elastic clause at some point? Okay, a few people. Elastic clause is in Article 1, Section 8, and it reads, speaking about Congress, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So what they say is the forthgoing powers. The founders foresaw that these different things would come up, and therefore they built a document that was living and breathing, and that way it would change as we made new developments. Now, I find some flaws with the discussion and debate on those two evidences. As far as the elastic clause goes, if you look at it in context, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, it is completely dealing with the powers of Congress. It talks about to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Boy, Congress does that pretty well, I'll tell you. To establish post offices and post roads, to provide and maintain a navy, and it goes through it. There's many, many powers that the Congress, as far as legislatively, has. And if you look at the context, it's speaking about all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So the powers that have been mentioned here, Congress is given the power to carry those laws into effect as time goes on and what is needed. And if you'll notice in a lot of the different amendments to the Constitution, you will see, after they mention the amendment, they will say, Congress is given the power to create laws for the enforcement of this. Now that's a paraphrase, but for the enforcement of this amendment. So it's not uncommon for them to do that. And I think that it's important to note that before just trying to say that by doing that they were pushing a broad platform of loose interpretation. There are other arguments about the founders were too smart to create a never-changing document. The problem with that is that the Constitution isn't a never-changing document. We can amend the Constitution. The argument for the strict interpretation of the Constitution is that if a word is in the Constitution, it means what it meant when it was passed. But that does not mean that if you think that something is wrong, you can try to put together a convention to try to change the Constitution. We're going to have Ken Quinn speaking later, and he's going to speak in depth on that subject far better than I could. So it is not a correct statement to try and say that, well, if you believe in a strict interpretation, then the Constitution can't change, because it can. It just requires a little bit more effort than just saying, well, I don't think it means that anymore. Now I want to look at the strict interpretation of the Constitution and why I personally believe the strict interpretation is what was intended. And that's what the founding fathers themselves intended. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to A. Gallatin in 1808, said, quote, "The true key for the construction of everything doubtful in a law is the intention of the lawgivers." So he's saying when you have official law, any question about that, go back to what the lawgivers wanted it to be. He said in a letter to William Johnson, dated June 12, 1823, he said, quote, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." That's a very straight statement that the Constitution is meant to mean what it says and say what it means, unless you want to go through a constitutional amendment. James Wilson, in the study of law in the United States, he was a signer of the U.S. Constitution. He was, I believe, a representative for the state of Pennsylvania and also served as an associate justice on the Supreme Court. He said, quote, "The first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it." You're reading these and you're seeing the general interpretation. They're saying when you see a law, you go back to what the person who wrote it said. John Marshall, in his opinion as Chief Justice in Marbury v. Madison, 1802, I have some reservations about Marbury v. Madison, but that's beside the point. Marbury v. Madison, 1802, he said, quote, "The particular phraseology of the Constitution of the United States confirms and strengthens the principle supposed to be essential to all written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts as well as other departments are bound by that instrument." There's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. When you have Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, and James Wilson, all very respected, two of them founding fathers, one of them a key Supreme Court judge, these aren't just people who don't know anything like myself. These are people who have done a lot of study, they did a lot of experience, and they themselves were involved, generally speaking, with the Constitution in one way or another. And they had a generalized understanding of how it worked. And I'm not finding, the only thing that you can really find for a loose interpretation where the founders viewed it is the allowance of a constitutional amendment. You don't find just an open door. It's literally an open field of power at that point. Because if you can say, well, a word that means this doesn't mean that tomorrow, where does it end? If freedom of speech means freedom of speech in 1787, but words can change, what does it mean in 2017? Huh? Safe zones. Well, yes, that's a minor technicality there, but there is no limit to where it goes from there, and that's why I think the founders knew what it was like to live under somebody who tried to bend and twist the law to create himself into a monarchy. That's why we left Great Britain in the first place. So to say that they just sort of created a document that just changed without a check and balance is unsupported, and I think that the argument for a strict interpretation is supported by the Constitution itself. The preamble of the Constitution, I would try to recite it, but I don't want to mess it up, says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." You may think, well, where does interpretation of the Constitution come in there? It says, do ordain and, I apologize, wrong line, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. If the words in a document can change, how can the liberties that they were looking to enshrine in this document be secure? So if without a constitutional amendment, how can you change and secure the blessings of liberty, not just to yourself, but if it's a living document, there's no guarantee it's going to protect your freedoms, let alone the freedoms of your posterity, of your future generations. And I think that in and of itself, if you look at that very wording, there is an assumption in the preamble that these are concrete, God-given, constitutionally guaranteed rights that without a constitutional amendment cannot be taken away. And why do I sort of harp on this a lot as far as the loose and why do I make a speech out of this? It's because it's important. And if you look at almost every single debate on the Bill of Rights or on just most issues of the Constitution, you can really boil it down to how do the two different parties interpret the Constitution? How do the two different sides interpret the Constitution? Because the fact of the matter is you can pick up the Constitution and you can look at something, and if you have two different interpretations about how the Constitution is to be written, you can come up with two completely different opinions. And that's exactly what you have here. An example would be separation of church and state. Now, how many of you have heard that phrase? Oh, yeah. Okay, I figured we would see a few on that one. This is pushed as if government is involved in something, there can be no religious, really, affiliation whatsoever. And it really does come down to the fact of the matter is that if you look, the Founder Fathers did not believe in that, because if you read some of the things that they said, there was anything but a separation. Religious thought influenced their decisions. No matter what religious affiliation they had, it influenced what they believed and how they created law. A couple of examples would be John Adams saying that, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." That's including religion. That's saying that religious thought needs to have a strong hold in our government. Another example would be George Washington. Speaking on the adoption of the Constitution, he said, "The adoption of the Constitution will demonstrate as visibly the finger of Providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate it." When you read the Founding Fathers, you see at the very least a high respect for moral and religious law. You can't help but read their writings and come away with that feeling, with that notion. Thomas Jefferson himself, the actual phrase separation of church and state doesn't even come from the Constitution. It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to, I believe, a group called the Danbury Baptists. And they were worried about, after the ratification of the Constitution, about a state religion being formed that would bar other religions. And he wrote them and said, no, there needs to be a wall of separation between church and state. 2 days after he wrote that letter to them, he attended the First Capitol Church, which was located inside the Capitol building, and listened to a friend of his, a Baptist minister, deliver a sermon that day. That very action suggests that Thomas Jefferson himself, the inventor of the phrase separation of church and state, didn't believe it in the way that it is pushed today. And yet, this is why a loose and strict interpretation of the Constitution is so important, whether you have one or the other. Because if you have a loose interpretation, you can just look at it and you can just say, well, yes, but things have changed now. Our culture has changed, and now things are different. It doesn't mean what it once did. But if you look at it strictly, you say, no, without constitutional amendment, you can't just change words. So that's why it's vitally important. This is just one of example. You have the Second Amendment. You have many other debates about the First Amendment with freedom of speech and safe spaces and things like that. And all those play into how does your interpretation come into it. It's very important that we know how to interpret and defend the Constitution. The Constitution's been entrusted to we the people. I mean, if we entrust it to the government, governments can start out well-intentioned, but every lesson in human history says that sooner or later well-intentioned governments slide off. It requires an informed we the people to keep a strict interpretation of the Constitution and to ensure that our government stays within those limits, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level. It is vitally important that we do that. We need to defend our freedom. If you think about it, how many other nations in the world have the freedoms that we have here in America? I mean, some of the nations that I used to think were actually fairly good, like in Europe, for example, are completely tread on free speech. People who post quote-unquote hateful rhetoric on social media can go to jail for hateful rhetoric. That's not free speech in the sense that that does not protect free speech. And to give an example, I love stories. Ronald Reagan was a master at telling stories, and he loved to poke fun at his favorite target, communism. And a perfect example of the jealousy of other nations looking at the prosperity and the freedom here in America told the story that Fidel Castro was one day giving a speech in front of a large audience and going on at great length, and suddenly one voice out of the crowd said, "Peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jack." Castro went on, and again a voice said, "Peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jack." About the fourth time this happened, Castro stopped in the middle of his speech and said, "The next time he says that, I'm going to find out who he is and kick him all the way to Miami." And everyone in the crowd said, "Peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jacks." There is jealousy that we have here. There is the jealousy of the freedom and prosperity we have here in America. We cannot let the beacon of freedom that is the United States of America to go under. And think about it also in this terms. The people out there, those nations, for example, Cuba, those nations with more oppressive governments, they lose a beacon of hope. What do we lose? We lose our way of life. I've never known anything but freedom. And if we stand idly by and watch it all go away, it has been said that those who had the most to lose, if we stand by and watch our freedoms go away and we do nothing, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. We've got everything to lose, but we also have everything to gain by protecting our Constitution and by protecting our freedoms. And that's where I want to close with the Constitutional Awareness Pact. You know, it's not imperative that you join the Constitutional Awareness Pact to learn about the Constitution. You can pick up the Constitution online. You can buy it off the back table. You can get it anywhere. The reason why CAP, I believe, is a good vehicle is because it's just that. It is a vehicle. It is a group of people in an organized effort trying to get the Constitution out to as many people as we can. We've distributed hundreds of pocket constitutions throughout this area. That's something that I couldn't do personally. We've organized, this is our second event in such fashion, where we've been able to bring some really, really good speakers. I can't do that by myself. But CAP has been a great, and is a great, engine to, in an organized fashion, bring people together and get the Constitution out there to people. Folks, it's important that we never let our freedoms slip away. Or at the very least, let it be said that we stood up and we defended our freedoms. I'm not talking about going out there and picking up a gun. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having an intellectual ability to defend freedoms. So that, you know what, next time the person says, well, why should hate speech be allowed? We don't just say, well, because it's in the First Amendment. We need to be able to actually, on an intellectual basis, be able to speak with people on why we believe in freedom. And that's what CAP's all about. I sincerely hope you will consider joining, and I really appreciate y'all coming out. Thank you so much.